Hey folks, back when the channel started out, one of the first videos that really took off for me was comparing the GTX 1050 Ti against a used MSI GTX 970, which I picked up for the same price as a new GTX 1050 Ti. It was around 135 quid. Now that comparison made a huge amount of sense, with everyone fawning over the GTX 1050 Ti for its power sipping capabilities. And while that card did have some genuine use cases, in the grand scheme of things, those use cases were very small. And compared to a used card like the Maxwell based GTX 970, it made very little sense, especially at the same price. So fast forward 2 years and have things changed? Well, let's take a peek at the GTX 1650 pricing and sort it out by popularity over on OCUK. Thankfully, first of all, the cheaper options are, for the most part, more popular, with the 150 quid Zotac Gaming OC taking the top spot. But interestingly, right in the middle we've got 3 cards, the Gaming X, the ROG and the Windforce OC, all sitting at between £165 and £190 and all proven to be fairly popular. Very surprising is the MSI Gaming X is more popular than the MSI Ventus version, considering the delta in performance between the beefiest 6-pin 1650 and the cheapest 75W card is basically within margin of error in the real world. If we take an average price for all these cards listed on OCUK, then it comes in at a smidge over £160. So not everyone is going to be opting for the cheapest single fan SKU cards then, and today's comparison is squarely aimed at those buyers who are looking at the GTX 1650 and thinking, yeah, I like it, but I want a twin fan variant, which means they're going to be willing to part with between £160 and £190 in the process. Like back in 2017 when the GTX 970 came and stole the 1050 Ti's thunder as the value proposition, in 2019 this role lands firmly at the feet of this, the GTX 1070 8GB. In particular today I've got the Gaming X variant from MSI, which I picked up on eBay for 167 quid. Cheaper than the most expensive GTX 1650 by around 13% and 11% more expensive than the most popular option on OCUK. So this card is slap bang in the middle of the GTX 1650's price range. Comparing specs, the Turin based 1650 is built on a newer manufacturing process, 12nm versus 16, but it features less than half the amount of CUDA cores, 896 compared to the 1070's 1920. This means a similar percentage reduction in the number of texture mapping units, down to 56 from 120, and half the number of ROPs, 32 against 64. The 1650 also features only 4GB of GDDR5 frame buffer, compared with the 8GB on the 1070, while also being limited to 128-bit wide memory bus compared to 256-bit on the Pascal based card. So at this point we kinda know it's going to be a bit of a wash. But to try and stem the flow of losses for the GTX 1650, I've decided to make this test a little bit more unfair. Now the GTX 1650 is going to be pushed to its absolutely max stable overclock, which results in a peak boost clock a little bit shy of 2 GHz, which is more than you're going to get out of the box with any GTX 1650. And its GDDR5 memory is running with a 600 offset, which effectively increases its speed from the stock 8GB per second seen on all 1650s to over 9. For the 1070, well, this is a used card, and while I always like to tear them down and clean them up before I use them and test them, and while this one could certainly do with a bit of a clean and a swap out of the thermal paste, we're not going to do that. It simply came out of a brown box, wrapped in bubble wrap, and going straight into the test rig. It is completely stable in Firestrike though, dust and old thermal paste and all, and it's still hitting and even exceeding its advertised boost clock of 1771 MHz. So this test is going to show peak 1650 performance against that of an unloved, used and abused 1070 at the 1650's target resolution of 1920 by 1080. So with that in mind and trying out my new Intel 8700K test system running with 16GB of DDR4 memory on a Z390 motherboard, let's kick things off with a new game for me, Apex Legends at the high quality preset with TSAA enabled. Here the GTX 1650 is really playable, with an average frame rate being returned in the mid 70s, with the 1% lows hitting 60 FPS, so we're off to a good start. The GTX 1070 on the other hand manages to surpass 100 FPS on the averages, coming in at 110, and even the 1% lows is just tickling that 100 FPS mark. So in this first game we get 46% more performance, opting for the older Pascal card. An example of a fairly recent AAA title, Shadow of the Tomb Raider now at its highest settings, and the GTX 1070 averages 80 FPS, with its 1% lows sticking above 60. The 1650 averages in at 50 FPS, with the 1% lows just shy of 40 FPS. Tougher to run than the previous Apex Legends, but it still sees the GTX 1070 pull ahead by 64% on average frame rates. Next up, Forza Horizon 4 at the Ultra preset with MSA 2x on, and here the GTX 1650 it averages out at a really stable 60 FPS, with its 1% lows coming in the mid 50s, highly playable here. The GTX 1070 completely eclipses that though, with an average frame rate of 103, and its 1% lows sticking above 80 FPS. Battle Royale time now with Fortnite on the Epic preset. And again, the 1650 does actually a really nice job here, averaging in at just under 80 FPS, with the 1% lows just shy of 70. The GTX 1070 on the other hand averages out at 134 FPS, with its 1% lows staying well above 100. A bit of a tougher test for both cards now with Metro Exodus on the Ultra preset, and here the GTX 1650 it really struggles, offering up a console-like frame rate of 38 FPS on average and 30 FPS 1% lows. The GTX 1070 does manage to surpass that 60 FPS mark on average, and its 1% lows was hovering in the mid 50s. And in this test, the GTX 1070 was 83% faster on average, just highlighting that when games get more demanding, the 1650 quickly falls off a cliff. Battlefield 5 now on the Ultra preset, and the 1650 kinda redeems itself here, 64 FPS on average with 1% lows in the mid 50s. The GTX 1070 however feels indefinitely smoother, with averages in the mid 90s and 1% lows in the mid 80s, and is about 50% faster than the 1650. Finally, the canned benchmark for Far Cry New Dawn, and here the GTX 1650 it offers up fairly good frame rates, 61 FPS on average and 52 FPS on the 1% lows. The 1070 storms ahead here, almost hitting 100 FPS on average, while the 1% lows hit 80 FPS. So it's pretty much a wash then for this. For roughly the same price, you can pick up a card which is on average around 60% faster at 1080p, and one which will last you a lot longer with its larger amount of VRAM and higher memory bandwidth, as well as just a beefier GPU that kinda hits the same clock speeds. But there are a few things to consider before we try and wrap this up. Firstly, as mentioned, the 1070 was tested out in less than optimal condition, with a cleaned up heatsink, freer flowing fans, and changing out the 2-year-old thermal interface material. I would expect the boost clocks that I've seen to increase a little, comparing it with some of the other 1070s I've had in here. This of course would only increase the gap between the two cards. Secondly, if we consider the bottom end of the 1650 lineup, a single fan variant at say 140 quid, price to performance ratios would dictate you could still spend up to £224 on a GTX 1070 before the 1650 was technically offering you more bang for your buck. And these days you're going to most definitely be able to find a 1070 for around that price or much less, with a little bit of patience. Likewise for this example, even if I factored in a 80 plus bronze 500 watt PSU from the likes of EVGA on top of the price that I paid for this Gaming X card, which is going to more than accommodate a 1070 by the way, we would still be coming in at under that £220 odd limit. Meaning whichever way you try and push it, the 1650 is just not good value. In every scenario, the used Pascal card comes out on top. Every scenario of course, other than if you've bought a pre-built, which is a proprietary PSU, but as I've mentioned in previous coverage of the 1650 in 2019, you really don't need to go down that route. There's so many good used computers out there on eBay and similar marketplaces that you really don't need to be constrained to a used HP or Dell anymore. The one case that I could potentially see the 1650 making sense is if your build really requires a low profile GPU, as at this stage it is technically the most powerful card which ships in a half height configuration. but these tend to be on the upper end of the pricing scale, so really if you're looking at a 1650 and there's even a whiff of a chance that you're absolutely not limited to it, then just do yourself a favour and look elsewhere. Now I know there's going to be a few of you throwing around the old used versus new argument isn't fair, but there's also a counter for that. And it's one that's equally as appealing as the 1070 and price performance stakes, and we can take a look at that in another video. So I guess that's it then, another generation of Nvidia's 50 series cards trying to milk would-be gamers at the low end for all they're worth, and being comprehensively pummeled into submission by the previous generation's mid-tier offerings, even more so this time than when it was with Maxwell and Pascal. But hey, let me know what you would go for. Could you be the 0.1% that can actually genuinely justify the use of a 1650? If you are, let me know down below, and if not, how's the 1070 looking for you in your region? Here in the UK, it's by far and away one of the best bang for buck cards out there on the used market at the moment. I'll leave it there for now though, so thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you all in the comments section down below, and in the next video. And who knows, maybe by then we'll have found a legitimate reason for buying a 1650.